Have you ever looked at all the Latin words being thrown around by zoologists and wondered what on earth are they talking about? If you're interested in understanding how different species are related and how scientists use unique names to be able to track the evolutionary history of every species on Earth, then this video is for you.
Subscribe to Ferroforest to keep learning about UK nature.
In this video, I'm going to teach you about the 3 different methods that zoologists use to classify species and how they all combine together to form a logical classification system that anybody can use to be able to understand the evolutionary relationships between different species.
All plants, animals, and bacteria on Earth are related to each other.
As time goes on, different barriers appear that separate groups of species so they can no longer all breed together.
This could be something physical, like a massive earthquake tearing a gorge on the land so that 2 groups are physically separated. Or it could be less obvious, like some individuals having a preference for only breeding in the winter and others in the summer.
Over time, this separation means that all of the individuals in one of the groups will be more closely related to each other and have more similar characteristics to each other as compared to all the individuals in the other groups. Random genetic changes appear naturally within populations and can change them, but they occur differently within different populations. And so eventually over time, as these changes are happening within different populations, you'll have 2 new distinct species forming.
This process has happened many times over the history of life on Earth, resulting in the huge diversity of life that we have now.
One of the aspects of nature that scientists need to understand is when all of these different splits happened and how they led to all the species that we see living around us today. That's why we have cladograms, which are diagrams which depict the relationships between different species.
These diagrams can be drawn to varying levels of completeness. This one has been stylized to look more like a tree and aims to be a completed cladogram, depicting the relationship between every species that has ever existed. An incomplete cladogram can be much more practical for explaining concepts, as it depicts just the species that an individual scientist is discussing. At the top of a complete cladogram is the first living organism to exist. From this, as time goes on and new species evolve, the cladogram splits. These splits can continue at different rates, with some species going extinct along the way, until we see only those species that still exist. By tracing up from the living species to the point on the cladogram where the lines meet, we can find the common ancestor of these species, or the most recent individual from which all organisms that came afterwards were descended. The common ancestor to all plants, animals, and bacteria is known as LUCA, or the last universal common ancestor.
An easy way to demonstrate common ancestors is with a small cladogram that depicts mammals as a group.
All mammals share the same common ancestor, a species that eventually evolved into the wide range of mammals that exist today. But mammals fit into 3 well-known groupings: placentals, marsupials, and monotremes. As you can see from this cladogram, as you travel upwards, the common ancestor of placentals and marsupials appears first, meaning that within mammals, all placentals and marsupials are more closely related to each other than they are to monotremes.
This means that a koala and a killer whale are more closely related to each other than they are to a platypus. Scientists need to be able to be specific about which species they're referring to when they're talking about groups of related organisms. To be able to do this, we group species into taxa. A taxon is simply a grouping of related species, which we know about thanks to our cladogram. These groupings, or taxa, are each given their own unique rank depending on how far back the common ancestor of the group existed. Specific groups within each rank are given their own unique scientific name, so that each species has a very long list of scientific names that corresponds to exactly how they evolved and how they're related to every other species on the planet.
I know that can be a bit confusing, so let's take a look at an example using the most common taxa and a species familiar to those of us in the UK, the red fox.
Going as far back into evolutionary history as we can go, we have life, which contains a group of all species on Earth. Species that exist within the taxonomic ranking of life don't actually get their own unique scientific name because it's a group that contains all species anyway. Moving a little bit more recently, we have the next taxonomic grouping, which is called domain. Now, I'm not going to get into the debate about how many domains there are here, so I'm just going to simplify that by saying that we have 3 domains. Now, this is where groupings start to get their own unique name, so each domain has a unique scientific name for all of the species within that grouping. For the grouping that foxes are later evolved into at a much later stage in history, that grouping is called Eukaryota. The next most recent taxon will start to become a bit more familiar to you. Each domain is divided up into smaller groupings called kingdoms. For our red fox, the kingdom that it sits within is called Animalia, or in English, animals. All animals exist within the Animalia kingdom, as compared to a different eukaryote kingdom called Plantae, which all plants exist within. Let's narrow it down a bit further with another common ancestor. Kingdoms are all divided into smaller groupings which are known as phylums. For the red fox, it sits within the phylum called Chordata. Now, all Chordata are related and have traits in common, but it gets a bit harder to define what those are. For Chordata, the traits that are associated with this grouping are all related to developmental stages, but it's a bit more in depth than I'm able to go into for this video. The next taxonomic rank is class. For red foxes, every animal that lives within their class is a mammal belonging to the class called Mammalia. All mammals, including people, share a common ancestor more recently with each other than they do with other species. That's how we know that red foxes and humans are more closely related to each other than they are to another species like a lizard. Lizards are eukaryotes, they are chordates, but unlike us in the mammal class, they belong to the reptilia class, or reptiles. Narrowing it down again, the next rank that we have for taxa is order. This is where we split away from the red foxes and belong in different groups. Red foxes belong to an order known as Carnivora, or the carnivores, whereas humans belong to a different order which includes all primates. Even more closely related is the next taxonomic rank of family, which for foxes is Canidae. Following family, we have smaller groups of genus, for which the red fox belongs to Vulpes. Then we come to the smallest grouping of related individuals on our list, which is known as species. The fox also belongs to the Vulpes species, but notice how the letter isn't capitalized at the start of this word, like it is for every other name on the list. It is these two final taxonomic rankings of genus and species which combined together give every single species on our planet a unique scientific name, which stays the same regardless of which language you're speaking in. This name is known as a binomial name, and the naming system that gives each species one of these names is called binomial nomenclature.
While this animal is known as a red fox in English, it's also called der Fuchs in German, le renard in French, kitsune in Japanese, Lisa in Russian, and a whole host of other translations in different languages. In order to make sure everyone across the scientific community is talking about the same species of fox, the red fox, as opposed to a species like the fennec fox, we need a unique name regardless of the language.
That's the purpose of binomial nomenclature. No matter what language you're speaking in, if you refer to the fox as Vulpes vulpus, then everyone knows that you're referring to what we in English call the red fox. If you refer to the fox as Vulpes zerda, then everyone knows that you're calling it what we in English call the fennec fox. Each of these individuals belong to the same closely related group, the genus Vulpes, but within that group, they each have a unique name for their species, being either Vulpes or zerda. So how do these classification systems all tie in together? Let's take a look at 4 species and see if we can work out how closely related they are. Let's look at the great white shark, the orca, the mountain hare, and the oak tree.
On the side here, I have the taxonomic ranks we used earlier in the video. Each of the 4 species are indeed separate species, so we can put their images along the bottom under species, and include their binomial names so that we can make it clear to anyone globally which species we're talking about. As you can see, all the genus names are different, so we can't draw any connections yet. The same is true for family and order. Our most recent common ancestor appears when we get to class. Both orcas and mountain hares are mammals, so we can join their lines together, and we have our most closely related species out of the 4 we're looking at. Further up the ranks, we get to phylum, and you can see another relationship has formed. Because they are from the same class, both orcas and mountain hares are also in the same phylum, but now great white sharks have joined them, leaving oak trees as the only species not part of this group. Going up again to the kingdoms, oak trees are still on their own, but at the highest level of ranking, all 4 of our species share a common ancestor, all existing within the domain of eukaryotes. This is our cladogram for our 4 species of interest, showing that orcas and mountain hares are most closely related, followed up by those 2 species and great white sharks, and finally most distantly related are all of these animals with the oak tree.
The great thing about this system is that once you know it, you can use it for any species, and there's a particularly great resource out there to be able to help you: Wikipedia.
Go to the Wikipedia page for a species you're interested in and look on the right-hand side. There will be a list of the scientific classifications that the animal fits into. You can use these to compare different species, or even click one of the taxonomic ranks to find cladograms that have already been uploaded online.
Make sure to check out some of my other videos to learn about more scientific concepts, or look out for binomial names being used within my wildlife species videos.